Good evening. My name is David McKnight, and I'm the chair of the Rosenbach Lectures Selection Committee. It is my great pleasure to welcome those of you who are present in the class of 78 Pavilion and our viewers who are joining us for this evening's lecture on Zoom. Dare I say it, this is Michael Suarez's final lecture. In his topical and relevant 2021 Rosenbach Lectures series entitled Printing Abolition, How the Fight to Ban the British Slave Trade Was Won, 1783-1807. His lecture this evening is entitled The Weight of the Chain, the West India Planters and Merchants Publication Committee. I'd just like to mention that we do have, again this evening, an exhibition of relevant abolitionist print in the Lee Library, and you're welcome to examine that after the lecture. Before I hand the camera over to Professor Rosie Chartier, who will introduce Michael this evening, I wanted to digress for a brief moment. For the past 12 years, I've had the privilege of chairing the Rosenbach Lecture Selection Committee. This honor is now in the capable hands of Sean Quimby, director of the Kislak Center, and Lynn Farrington, director of the Kislak Programming. I'm an inveterate literary tourist. One of the reasons I came to Penn in 2006 was to selfishly walk in the shadows of Ezra Pound and William Carlos Williams, Penn alums 120 years ago, and who were the progenitors of modern Anglo-American poetry and my heroes. To my mind, Pound and Williams were what, to a Canadian, made Penn famous, in the case of Pound, perhaps infamous. However, I soon discovered that nested in the Kislak Center, there existed a sort of academy. I sometimes thought of it as a secret society devoted to the study of book history. I was a practitioner and advocate of the subject in Canada. A newbie at Penn, it seemed like I had, like Polifilo, entered into a dream world where I was confronted by the fearsome gatekeepers, Peter Stollybras, Dan Traster, Jerry Singerman, Jim Green, and Michael Suarez, and Rosie Chartier, among others, all of whom are the brilliant magisters of the alchemical art of discovering the gold in the dross of material texts. I'm still in their awe. Over the past 15 years, Peter, Jerry, and now Zach Lesser and John Pollock, my dear colleague, have and continue to shape the weekly History of Material Text seminar, an ad hoc graduate studies program, in my opinion, producing future book historians like Penn PhD candidate Aileen Malcolm, a fellow Montrealer, who is monitoring Zoom questions this evening. Thank you, Peter, Jerry, Michael, John, and Dan. I have learned so much from you all. I'm pleased to announce that barring further postponements due to COVID-19, the 2022 Rosenbach Lectures will be delivered by Peter MacDonald, Professor of English and Related Literatures at St. Hugh's College, Oxford. Peter's scholarly interests are wide-ranging, from 18th century studies to post-colonial and world literatures. The title of his lecture is, tentatively, The Secret Life of Books. Peter writes, and I quote, "The series will be about the terra incognita of book history, or in other words, the mysteries of reading as an act of inner appropriation, which Robert Darnton once described as the ultimate stage in the communication circuit," end quote. Peter's lectures are scheduled for March 2022. Please stay tuned. Without further ado, it is my honor to welcome Rosie Chartier, who will introduce our speaker this evening. Rosie Chartier is a professor in the Collège de France and the Annenberg Visiting Professor of History at the University of Pennsylvania. He frequently lectures and teaches in the United States, Spain, Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina. His work in early modern European history was rooted in the tradition of the Annales School, which was primarily dedicated to the history of education, the history of the book, and the history of reading. Rosie's publications are numerous, but I do recommend his 2008 Penn Press book, Inscription and Erasure, literature and written culture from the 11th to the 18th century. I hope he is considering a companion volume that deals with the past 200 years of print production. During the winter term, Roger takes up a weekly residence in the Lee Library, where his students are dazzled by his keen analytical mind, scholarship, and brilliance. In my opinion, without question, Roger is the leading scholar in the vast field of the study of the cultures of the book, who is active today. In 1994, he too delivered the Rosenbach lectures. His lectures were entitled Forms and Meanings, Texts, Performances, and Audiences from Codex to Computer. Although Roger might not be a prophet, I would point out that on the pen press table in front of the elevators, there is a copy of Matthew Kirschenbaum's provocative 2016 Rosenbach lectures, Bitstream. By the way, there's a 40% discount off the cover price. I am sure that the future of the Rosenbach lectures will tangle with this gnarly question of the materiality of bits and bytes. But it is now my pleasure to welcome, live from Paris, Professeur Rosie Chartier.
Thank you very much, David, for this generous and kind introduction. It's a great pleasure for me to be present in the 6th floor today for introducing Michael Suarez's third Rosenbach lecture. Following the example given by his lecture, my introduction will be transatlantic. On YouTube, you can listen to a lecture delivered by Michael in February 2018 in Charlottesville. Under the title, Glorious Bookishness, this lecture celebrated, as does the series he is presenting at Penn during this week, the power of bibliography and book history. Michael began this lecture with a personal remembrance of a cry he addressed to his father when he was a teenager and traveled with his family. The cry was, "Stop the car." Why was it necessary to stop the car? Because the young Michael collected in the ponds along the road lichens, green algae, and muck he later observed under his microscope. He said, "I was driven by wonder." Later in his life, he encountered another wonder, the leather-bound books owned by the professor who taught the class on early modern British poetry he was attending. Thanks to these books shown to him, the poems were no more inert text on the pages of a boring textbook. They became living objects that embodied the joys and pains, not only of the poets who wrote the works, but also of the entire community of the makers of the books. Michael perceived that multiple human presences inhabited in these volumes. It was another marvel he is still enjoying today and shares with us. What makes Michael Suarez scholarship so unique is his inexhaustible desire for wonder. His passionate knowledge transmutes the driest bibliographical collation into a journey in a wonderland, a severe compositor study into a detective novel, and book history into a Balzacian comédie humaine. If you do not believe me, return to YouTube and stop the car for attending his lecture on the business of abridgments in the 18th century, the ecosystems of book history, or the problem of presence in codex and digital images. The topics are rather austere at first glance, but Michael's magic transformed them into fascinating human adventures. This extraordinary ability to consider every book as an expressive object, as the archive of expectations and dreams, commitments and sentiments, strategies and sensitivities, ties Michael's work with Don Mackenzie's legacy. As recalled on Monday by Peter Stalibras, Michael was Don Mackenzie's student, and he shares with him the same humble respect for all those who have written, edited, published, composed, printed, bound, or read the books we study. In a volume published in Wellington, dedicated in commemoration of Don Mackenzie, Michael quotes Mackenzie's words, and I quote the quote: "The signs we read in the artifacts we keep tell us of lives lived by men and women who had identities just as distinct and valuable as our own. Understood in this manner, bibliography, or the sociology of text, or book history, as you prefer, is not only a knowledge that encompasses in the same analysis the production, circulation, and reading of the written words. It has also an ethical dimension. It is a moral necessity." In a graduation address delivered in 1997 at Victoria University, Don Mackenzie said to the students, I quote, "The humanities, after all, takes a definition from the special qualities that give life a human nature. It is a reason why President Obama invited Michael to be part of the National Council on the Humanities in 2015. It is also these specific qualities that constitute the common base for his innumerable activities. In the ecosystem of book history, Michael Suarez occupies all the places. As a scholar, he wrote on Poe, Swift, Fielding, and Richardson, on Thibault and Malone, on satire and novel. As an editor, he co-edited in 2009 the 5th volume of the Cambridge History of the Book in Britain, and the colossal endeavors that were the Oxford Companion of the Book in 2010, and the book A Global History in 2013. He is currently co-general editor of the 8 volumes of Gerard Manley Hopkins' complete works and of the 23 volumes of Alexander Pope's collected works. Michael is at the same time a poet, a professor, a curator, a Jesuit, and also a character in the movie True Blue that narrates the dramatic 1987 boat race between Oxford and Cambridge at the time when the true Michael was the president of the boat club of Campion Hall. In this film, the character Michael Suarez is played by the American actor Dylan Baker. The scriptwriter Rupert Walters was struck by the physical resemblance between them. I quote, "On set, I kept being deferential towards Dylan, thinking he was a priest and that I should not swear in front of him. It is perhaps Dylan Baker who shall give the Rosenbach lecture today. Who knows?" In any case, the Michael Suarez of the movie declares, "We can, and God willing, shall win," and Oxford won. In an interview he gave in 2014 as director of the Rare Book School, Michael Suarez declared, I quote, "We start with the fact that every book is a coalescence of human intentions." It was his own manner to reframe the Spanish Golden Age metaphor that attributed to book as to human creature, a body and a soul. Thanks to the pressmen and the binders, the body is elegant, handsome, harmonious. Thanks to the compositor, the copy editor, the proofreader, the soul of the book, the doctrine or the fable created by the author can appear in an adequate presentation. It is the reason why Michael said it is essential to have a thoroughgoing knowledge of the multiple ways the artifacts make their meanings. In this Rosenbach lecture, once again, Michael Suarez associates the two dimensions of his humanist scholarship. On the one hand, a rigorous expertise, attentive to specific objects, unexpected clues, particular accidentals. And on the other hand, a broad historical vision of the sentiments and ideas, commitments and emotions that change the world, sometimes for the best. It is no better wonder than the first mass media campaign that led to the ban of the British slave trade. Michael rewrites its narrative by analyzing the publishing strategies, the different distribution networks, the circulation and appropriation of books, pamphlets, and engravings denouncing slavery. His work, thus, is addressing two fundamental issues. First, he locates this important chapter of the history of print culture within the framework of the multiple connected histories that linked both sides of the Atlantic. Second, Michael shows how it was essential for the abolitionists the establishment of truth, the gathering and publication of the evidence that unveiled and exposed the odious realities of slavery. This successful quest for truth is a lesson for the historians who construct, as does Michael, the true knowledge of the past in a time, our time, perverted by untruthfulness. The title of this third and alas, last Rosenbach lecture is The Weight of the Chain, the West India Planters and Merchants Publications Committee. Please welcome with me.
Rosie Chartier, you're a terrific scholar and you're a very gracious friend. Thank you so much for that introduction. The West Indian planters, that is to say, the pro-slavery lobby, had a persistent problem on its hands. And that problem was that they were getting a lot of bad publicity for the behavior of their membership. Consider, if you will, for a moment, the incident of the Zhong, the notorious incident of the Zhong, where 132 enslaved Africans were thrown overboard alive. The judge's original ruling said the case of the slaves was the same as if horses had been thrown overboard, and the people of Great Britain said, this must not be. And the percipient Granville Sharp didn't call it the Zhong incident, but the Zhong Massacre. The fact that this lived on in the British imagination is testified in Turner's powerful and arresting painting you see here in 1840, The Slave Ship. The human traffic on which the sugar colonies depended was a moral enormity, stain on England's self-image as the land of liberty. And this became a major site of contest. I submit to you that the durable traces of that contest are found in the print record. And so we should study wisely and well, with condign judiciousness, that printed record in all its complexity and pluriformity in order to see what we can discern about the historical record and the behavior of the men and women who fought the war for the soul of the British nation, whether or not the slave trade would be abolished. it's true that long before the subcommittee of the planters got into full action, there were lots of people who were advocating for the planters' interest, that is to say, who were pro-slavery. This from the Gentleman's Magazine, all the way back in '89. A Negro removed to the West Indies is placed in a climate much more agreeable to a labor than the burning plains of Africa, as if this person would know. His work in the plantations is not harder or more oppressive than that of our common laborers in England. The vulgar are influenced by names and titles. This is like corporate speak in America today. Instead of slaves, let the Negroes be called assistant planters, and then there'll be no problem at all. Thank you very much. The fatuousness of this argument being promulgated in 1789 is, I think, representative of kind of arguments that are marshaled on behalf of the slave trade well before the planters subcommittee really gets going, and by the planters publication subcommittee, as we can see. If the last couple of lectures were about the fight to establish truth, today is in part about the publishing campaign to promulgate lies. And it's difficult stuff, I need to tell you. But it's important, it seems to me, that we study it and that we study it carefully to understand how falsehood is promulgated. Not for its own sake, but because we need to understand this half of the fight if we want to understand what the abolitionists were up against and how they in turn tried to, as it were, fight fire with fire. Print is the site of contest. Print is the durable trace of a war of morality, a war of politics, a war of economics. We need to follow the spoor, and that spoor is print. So it's also true we left off with the sugar pamphlets. We left off last time with the address to the people of Great Britain, and here is a pamphlet published early in '92 by T. Boozy, who we'll come back to. And you can see that an address to the people of Britain on the propriety of abstaining claims particularly notice, not on account of the judicious arguments, but on account of the fallacious reasoning and inconclusive arguments sophistically made use of in favor of a darling hypothesis. Another reason also why this pamphlet claims particular attention is the rapid and extraordinary manner in which it has been circulated in all parts of this kingdom. An amazing omission. But this pamphlet is, I submit to you, nowhere recorded in the annals of the publication committee of the West Indian planters. There are multiple agencies at work. Just as we established in the second lecture that there's lots of publication taking place outside of the London committee, so too, let it be remembered that there's lots of publication taking place outside of the London Planters Committee as well. Here's what it looks like. And here's the document that is now at the University of West Indies and had been in London and was patriated to the Caribbean as being more appropriate to be there, probably I think in 2006, but I may be wrong. And you can see the committee was established in February '88, but not very active. It was enlarged on 19 January '92, which is when this book starts. and then enlarged again in March. There's going to be a big vote in Parliament, decisive vote in Parliament in April of '92. And the pro-slavery lobby is arming up for the fight. And this is what it looks like, astonishingly like the Abolition Society's minute books as well. Almost mirror image, if you will, of dark and light. I'd like to remember here at this slide to thank Amy Speckert, who has been an invaluable research assistant over many years to me and who deserves appropriate acknowledgement in these lectures, along with Michael von Hoos of the University of Virginia, whom I mentioned earlier. The organizers of this pro-planter subcommittee on publications, that is to say, the pro-slavery publishers, if you will, were George Hibbert and Sir William Young, both with very strong ties to the sugar colonies and very able gentlemen, if they can be called so, indeed. The first key point is that the planters did not need to have a bake sale in order to mount their publishing campaign. They didn't need to take up subscriptions because they were a huge corporate enterprise. This is big, big, big business, and all they need to do is establish a levy. 1773, the value from Jamaica alone of the imports is 5 times greater than everything from what would come to Britain from what became the United States. One island, 5 times. That is an astonishing thing. That's not just sugar. 100,000 plus hogshead of sugar per annum. So we read, fast forward a little bit on the memo of '92 in the Planter's Minute book here, that in '89 and '90, they were taxing rum, sugar, cotton, pimento, ginger, logwood, fustic, mahogany, etc. And they're charging a levy on everything. They don't have a money problem. In fact, if anything, they have, as we might see, too much money, and they spend it all out to make sure they find a way to win the crucial vote in April '92. So over the course of '92-3, they spend about twice as much, but because publications are coming from all over the UK and not just from these 2 committees, there's still a preponderance in terms of number of titles of pro-abolition titles. So let's begin then with 23 January '92 and the first publication recorded in the minute book of the West Indian Planters Subcommittee on Publication. Resolved that the expenses for publishing the speech made to the National Assembly on the 3rd of November by the deputies from the General Assembly of the French part of Saint Domingo be paid by this committee. Okay, and go through it, see what it's like. And sure enough, ESTC bizarrely says we couldn't locate the original. It's on Gallica. It's in the BNF, ESTC. So here's the original. Here's the reprint. It came out already in London in late '91. Now here in early '92, they've seen it and they have found gold for their purposes. A group of young Turks from Saint-Domingue have come to Paris to give both barrels to the National Assembly about the Amis des Noirs, to say it's the friends of the blacks who have caused this insurrection and they must be crushed. You must protect your economic interest. And these fanatic philosophers have nearly created the ruin of all the sugar colonies. A shoal of writings, previous and subsequent, have been disseminated among our gangs. There have been read and commented upon those terrible words, perish the colonies. Here you see, could the Negroes, assailed by so many temptations, worked on by so many maneuvers, stimulated by libels, written in characters of blood, read at evenings in their huts in the midst of assemblies of their chiefs, by men breathing only disorder and pillage, could they long resist the vertigo with which they were stricken? So this hyperinflated language is a transcript of the speech that they made. And I've checked the translation. I've had people whose French is better than my high school French check the translation. It's accurate. It's what was truly said. It's not the case, as I had supposed, that the West Indian planters in London doctor the translation. No, the inflated rhetoric is by these deputies who have come from Haiti to Paris, and they're full of fury at what has happened, and they have to find a scapegoat, and it is the Amis des Noirs. So they see that the Amis des Noirs are useful, and they say they corrupted the natives' minds with their pamphlets, which is a little bit difficult to imagine if you think about it, but that's what they argue. And they also play very deliberately on the most deep-seated fears of their auditors in the National Assembly and of the men and women who will read their words. And they give a bloody chronicle of the murder of children, of the murder and rape of women, of the betrayal of masters who were gracious to their slaves, called here servants, tellingly. And they play on these profound fears. And the rhetoric is powerful. And you can imagine that when the West Indian planters, who knew Wilberforce was going to move the motion again before the Commons in the spring, when they read this in late December or early January, they thought, this is gold for us. And so it is. And it's affected, they claim, through the pamphlets. And there's a new resolution that not only are they going to publish 8,000 copies of it or 3,000 copies of it, but here it'll be in 2 numbers of the European magazine for 5,500. And when you put them all together, 9,000 copies printed, plus it's going to be circulated, serialized in the Morning Chronicle, whose print runs are somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000. So when you think about the dissemination of this rhetoric and how it's kind of news from the front, what kind of effect would that have had? Very, very powerful, methinks. And this came ready-made propaganda to the West Indian planters in favor of conservatism that maintained order, as they saw it, and slavery. There you see the European magazine. Not all copies have the supplement. It's not actually 2 half sheets. It's actually 2 full sheets. They miscalculated, I think, the length of the document when they made the resolution, but there it is. And it appeared in 2 monthly installments, March and April, in the European magazine, which had a vast circulation. The European magazine was a distinctly pro-planter, that is to say, pro-slavery organ. So for instance, we see this comment on people who are abstaining from sugars. You know, yeah, I was told that the sugar had some flesh, but they say, no, you've been imposed upon by the naughty people, the little boy is told, who told you so for some wicked purposes of their own. You see the moral inversion here, right? We knew gentlemen who were in the sugar colonies, and they were never so well or happy as when they were making it. The poor Negroes don't work near as so hard as the men who dig your papa's hop grounds, and they live much better. And so this whole thing is a moral absurdity, they say, because they use the other products of slavery anyway. Well, where's the moral absurdity, I ask you? But this is very typical of the kind of piece, a very thinly veiled fiction that appears in the European magazine, which definitely runs pro-planter. It's also true that this accusation that the abolitionists, wittingly or no, fomented the revolution is responded to in this bibliographically puzzling pamphlet by our very own Thomas Clarkson. And the reason why it's deeply puzzling to me, at least, and perhaps some of you who are better informed can shed some light on this. What on earth is Clarkson publishing a refutation of a pamphlet that appears as much as 11,000 times from a little bookseller of no reputation and no real capital in Ipswich? I haven't been able to figure this out at all, but you can see that the great proponent of the French Revolution, who's just back from Paris, he adduces the rights of man, and he says that we cannot keep people in a state of subjugation who acknowledge no obligation to us, but by breaking their spirits and treating them as creatures of another species. You can only do this if you are unwilling to acknowledge the humanity of these enslaved peoples. And again, he adduces the rights of men. This is very inflammatory rhetoric at the time, right? And then he says, hey, I was in Paris, so I know about what really happened and what didn't. And this is for the benefit of the Abolition Committee. But how we understand this is very, as a rejoinder to what's been said, is difficult. It exists in a sole edition. And I believe it's authentic, and I've tried to kind of do some stylometrics to make sure that it accords, that it's congruent in some way with Clarkson's own rhetoric, and indeed it is. So I don't really understand the bibliographical force of this, much as I endeavored to understand the rhetorical force of it. The Planters Committee is endeavoring over and again to understand what the Abolition Committee is doing and to counteract what they've lately published. They are watching the press. They're reading the pamphlets. This is very much a call and response in a bad way kind of endeavor. And so they, let me just go back for a second. Here, they're going to publish the summary of the evidence. And you see here, the nature of the trade for Negroes, their kind treatment and happy situation being thus ascertained by such incontrovertible evidence, the absurdity of calling by the name of slaves people who are no more so than parish apprentices in England. I was reading some of these pamphlets in the library company in Philadelphia, and I had to quit for the day. It's very, very, very difficult to take a steady diet of this vomitus. And yet it's really important as part of the historical record that we take its full measure, it seems to me. Here is the reference to those in Russia. For example, the serfs, they will be adduced over and again in the pro-planter literature. Look at the serfs, and certainly our slaves are much better than the serfs in Russia. Here they say, let's get 200 copies of the speech in Santo Domingo deputies and send them out into the country. Let's make sure we answer the letter in the Morning Chronicle that said that the insurrection wasn't caused by the Ami de Noir. Make sure we publish a reply to that as soon as possible. They are paying close attention, and they're meeting almost every day. Nearly every day they're meeting for 3 hours. They begin by sitting there together in the committee and reading the papers, reading the pamphlets, taking notes on them, figuring out how to respond. This is very much a kind of media response endeavor. So here they've come across this pamphlet on the vindication of the use of sugar, and they say, let's find out who the author is so we can beef this up and republish it. And then they discover that it's Henry Clutterbuck, and that that Mr. Allen get the pamphlets and send them all to the committee so they can study it. And then Mr. Hibbert, who's one of the principals of the committee, should school Mr. Clutterbuck so he can up the rhetoric and give him some talking points for the second edition that we're going to publish. And here it is, all in a subvention, completely paid for, though you couldn't know unless you knew, unless you had the business records. Here, a pamphlet's been published called Remarkable Extracts, which we saw, and it's really indebted to a pamphlet called An Address to the People of Great Britain, well known to be written by Mr. Fox, formerly an eminent bookseller in Holborn. The gentleman has been not a little remarkable for the singularity of his opinions in general. They're very careful about libel, but they're saying he's a revolutionary. They're saying he's a Jacobin. They're saying he should be put in jail. So it's also true, ladies and gentlemen, that the planter subcommittee is brilliant at the camouflage book. Mr. George Hibbert, having reported that the nature of previous engagement with Dr. Benjamin Mosley by the planters, who invited him to the undertaking. So they've had a conversation with him. And now they say, hey, Dr. Mosley, we're going to publish 2,000 copies of your treatise on coffee, which he first published in 1785, went through several editions. You'll all be pleased to know, I was pleased to know, that he says, coffee's really good for you. Coffee's really good for you and you should drink it. You should drink lots of it. But what the heck is the committee doing, reprinting or printing a 5th edition of a medical treatise on the effects of coffee on the human body? Well, as it turns out, it's a way of arguing that capable, white, able-bodied men who don't have a lot of capital should go out to the sugar colonies and start small coffee plantations. And the payoff is that they can be part of the militia that keeps the sugar colonies safe. So the book looks like a medical treatise, but it ain't. The book is a medical treatise with a highly tendentious preface that says, if you're an Englishman and you need a second start in life, you don't need a lot of capital and you can be part of a great community. And we'll put a gun in your hand and you can keep those slaves down and ensure that there are no revolts and ensure that the commerce goes on as it's intended to go on. It's remarkable. It's a remarkable expedient, it seems to me, and deeply, deeply clever to publish a book in this way, it seems to me. You're going to be indispensable for the protection of these possessions. It's really important for the empire. So that's what this camouflage book is doing. Mosley himself, incidentally, isn't in medical literature for his coffee book. It's because he writes a book on sugar in 1799. And in that book, he says, vaccination is terrible. Vaccination will kill you. And he's not in this book, but I do love this cowpox cartoon here in which cows are coming out of the bodies of those who have been inoculated. Somebody please give them some ivermectin. It's also true that one has to be careful in reading these pamphlets. One can't discern their origin just by saying, here's Sewell and Murray and Debret. These are very, very frequent pro-planter publishers. They're very much in cahoots with the committee that we've been looking at. William Innes is advising the committee. He's a self-proclaimed West Indian merchant. This fanaticism about slavery, the temporary rise and the birth of sugar has made people crazy and they're abstaining from sugar. But we're not abstaining from gold and silver and they're the toil of slaves and we depend on those. So you see how fatuous all this is. This has nothing to do with the committee, although the committee knows about the book. They don't need to, they know, they're in correspondence with Innes quite a bit. He's an important factor, but this book is not, has no subvention from the committee itself. So to the antidote to popular frenzy, a word that's used quite frequently, is not a committee book, although again, published by booksellers who have everything to do with the committee, and adduces an address to the people of Great Britain, filled with false premises and false inferences drawn from them. By the same kind of reasoning, it might be proved that we have no moral right to impose labor or work upon any of our fellow creatures. Lotta, right? So they cry at every door murder, and more invective at the abolitionists for sure. The committee is also really good, not just at the camouflage book, but at the decoy book. Let's take a look. Resolved. Mr. George Hibbert be allowed to present Dr. William Thomson Fitzroy Suite with £50 to further the publication of the account of the Hebrides. The account of the Hebrides? What the heck is going on here? Okay, so William Thomson edited Buchanan's Travels in the Western Hebrides. Buchanan is a clergyman. Buchanan lived in the Western Hebrides. Buchanan was a kind of missionary there. And we read, though, that he, without Buchanan's knowledge, he inserted some severe criticisms of the Scottish clergy. Well, that ain't all he inserted. Thank you very much. Because if you look a little bit at the book, you see that way back in chapter 9, there is an extended comparison of the condition of the Hebrideans and other Highland Skalags, kind of indentured servants, with that of the Negroes in the West Indies. And again, published by the usual suspects of the booksellers. And what do we find out? We find out that there's this extended 7-point comparison in which, mirabile dictu, the slaves in the West Indies are so much better off, thank you very much, than these bonded servants in the Hebrides. And in fact, everybody knows, and I'm a clergyman, he ventriloquizes, charity should begin at home. So this is a theme in a lot of the literature. Why are you trying to help these people who aren't like us? Why are you trying to help these people who aren't worthy of your help? Why are you trying to help these people who are savages and barbarians when you have your own native Britons at home to whom you should be directing your charity? There's a fundamental moral flaw in what the abolitionists are trying to achieve, these pamphlets argue, because these people aren't like us and they don't really deserve our charity the way the tin miners, the coal miners, the indentured servants, the cottagers do. And that's one of these arguments by deflection that runs again and again and again. Breathtakingly, on the 1st of March, 1792, the committee minutes list 9 current sugar abstention pamphlets that are in circulation, and take note where they can, of who the publishing bookseller is. It's a remarkable thing, their attentiveness. They're very much alive to who's producing this print and where they're located. And we can see here, not surprisingly, Gurney, 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 right? So they're thinking, what's going on? So they get these pamphlets and they read these pamphlets. They got to get a sufficient number of each of the above pamphlets to give one, if possible, to each of the members of the committee, give them a whole set, and we'll take notes and we'll provide remarks to the author of the Vindication of the Use of Sugar, Henry Clutterbuck, so that he can again learn what we want him to say, and then he can publish the pamphlet. These are businessmen. These are businessmen who are meeting in the Marine Society or in Ibbot's Hotel and spending their afternoons doing this because they know what's at stake, because they know that they could lose, because there's an unprecedented campaign on for petitions. And they see that they're losing the public sentiment. So, abstract of the evidence favorable to the African cade's been produced by Mr. Franklin. That's not Benjamin. So let's print 5,000 of them. And in the same form and manner as the abstract produced on the other side of the question. They're really clever in this, right? They want you to be able to maybe confuse what it looks like. And this is what they eventually do. And Mr. Boozy, again, is the publisher. This new doctrine of abstinence has for its first and chief support the author of Address to the People of Great Britain on the propriety of abstaining. I am an enemy to all personal altercations which are inexcusable if invidious and improper, But this is completely invalidated, he says. This is invalidated. He doesn't know what he's talking about. They're worried. They're worried about their bottom line, and they're worried about what's going to happen in Parliament. So this goes on at some length here. I hope to, there's The disuse of produce on the west of the West Indian Islands will have no kind of effect on the slave trade generally. It's not going to make the slaves happier. It's not going to do anything. It's just willful misinterpretation. And the people who do this are naive, if not stupid. So there is in this minute book a factor who needs to come to light. It's pretty understandable to me that the West Indian planters themselves, who have huge investments, many of whom were born in the Sugar Islands, some of whom have gone back and forth to the Sugar Islands to superintend their properties, might themselves feel that they have their backs against the wall. But one of their hirelings, again and again and again, is a man named Mr. Bell. He appears scores of times in the minute book. And I'm here to tell you today that if you read the minute book closely, you find out that he is a great citizen of the Republic of Letters. He's Mr. John Bell, the great publisher who publishes the plays of Great Britain, who publishes the poets of Great Britain, and who's involved in the ownership of no fewer than 4 different newspapers. And John Bell, who will at one point go bankrupt not too long after this, needs the money, and the abolitionists ain't got the money. The fat cat businessmen have the money, and he becomes, John Bell, the darling of many literary production in the late 18th century. Mr. John Bell is the one who has the insider knowledge, both of the book trade and of the plethora of newspapers that are available and how they operate. This from Trussler's London Advisor and Guide, which I warmly recommend to you as making fascinating reading. But Bell knows how to navigate the depths and the shoals of the newspaper business, as well as the bookselling business. Thank you very much. And he becomes absolutely essential to their operation. He starts out getting paid £5 a week, then he gets paid 5 guineas a week. Then, because they do so well, he starts to get paid £10 a week. £10 a week. That's a remarkable salary. Why? Because they need him. And he needs them. And there is this kind of deeply unsavory bargain with the devil that is in none of the biographies of Mr. John Bell, typographical expert, newspaper maven, publisher extraordinaire to the Republic of Letters. It makes you wonder. Here we are, March 26th. Things are coming close now to a parliamentary debate. And fortunately, there's the true state of the question has been brought to them. They've heard it, and they say, let's get 8,000 right away. Mr. Bell will help us. And this is me. It's arguably the most brazenly mendacious pamphlet published in the whole affair. They want to make sure that it goes to the agents in the country, and they want to make sure that it's given to every alderman and the Common Council of the City of London. The fiction is that it's by a plain man who signed the petition at Derby. And what do we see? We see that the plain man signed the petition, but he's informed by a clergyman that he was badly mistaken in everything he believed. And if they abolish the slave trade, the blacks will be in a much worse state than they are. And he would know because he had been in Jamaica, and they've been delivered, thank you very much, from the miseries of Africa, where no comforter's enjoyment are on. they're far better off than the English working poor who are slaves to poverty and necessity. And they're not subject to so much labor as any working man in England. We should relieve the wants of our own poor. So there are 5 great lies that are marshaled. Slave trade preserves the lives of blacks, suppress the trade, and human sacrifices would be endless. Not sure where that comes from, but it's there. The life of a slave is held as sacred as that of a white person. And so on and so forth. They're much better off, and they could purchase their freedom if they wanted to, but they don't want to because they know that they're better off under their beneficent masters. Thank you very much. It's unbelievable, really. Here it is. Slave trade tends to preserve the lives of the blacks. Suppress the slave trade, human sacrifices would be endless. Couldn't make it up. So what's happening? The lies are getting more desperate because the vote in Parliament is getting closer and public opinion maybe hasn't really swung. It's in the interests of humanity even more than the interests of the state that should forbid the abolition of the slave trade. This is a brilliant moral inversion. Keep this person enslaved because it's really much better for him. That's quite astonishing. Bibliographically, this is a fascinating pamphlet because there are 2 issues from a single edition, one with no distinguishing markings except for the date, and that's the one that's to be distributed to the various officers of the state, as it were. And then the preponderance of the 8,000 printed copies have John Bell's name in the shop and the imprint. And there's something going on here because Bell is selling this pamphlet for 6pence, which is a whole lot of money for this kind of pamphlet, especially when you compare it to the sugar pamphlets. So is John Bell doubly on the make? It's a little bit hard to know, but we'll prescind from that for now. The penetration paid for of this essay into the public press is breathtaking. And again, imagine what's happening with the vote in the Commons, the debate, and then the subsequent vote in the Commons coming closer and closer and closer. This is a substantial work, and it's reprinted whole or in part over and over again with very studied, I think, distribution. And of course, this costs a guinea for half a column. So it's a lot of money being spent, but they have the money. The abolitionists don't really have the money. Here you see one example from the Hereford Journal. Convert to the truth. So ordered March 28th, 500 pamphlets published by Jesse Foote entitled Defense of the Planters in the West Indies be distributed to the members of the House of Commons. This is interesting. 28 March, they're going to start on 3 April. There are 3 editions. They're all 1792. It's pretty long. All has the same imprint. It's what you would expect. The problem is not the planters, thank you very much. The problem is the libidinous practices of the Negroes. Oh, and by the way, they drink too much as well. It's their moral turpitude that keeps them from being able to reproduce and necessitates the slave trade, not any behavior of overworking them, working them to death, not giving them adequate nutrition that keeps them from being able to breed. Well, what do you know? I'm so sorry. Let's just go back here. 3 editions here, all from the same sheets. And this is very widely distributed. I am a human and I feel for all mankind. This is the fiction of the kindly planter. And these 3 editions are a flood on the market Thank you very much. And we're going to facilitate an extensive circulation of the defense of the West Indian planters through all the country and principal evening newspapers. Mr. Bell will take care of that. And because he's taking care of that, let's pay him 433 quid. So contrast that with the remark of the member of the Abolition Committee who says, well, we haven't been able to make a lot of use of the newspapers because it costs too much, right? Now, this changes over time a little bit, but you see the contrast between the sort of large corporate conglomerate going for it and the abolitionists. It's also true that the Oracle is one of those incessant newspapers owned by John Bell, one of those incessant newspapers that keeps ringing the bell, no pun intended, against the abolitionists. Letters signed truth to real Englishmen, supporters of our Constitution, the real friends of their country, their king, and established religion. The Negroes in our islands are not overworked. They're not severely punished. They're better fed and better clothed and better lodged and better in every respect, happier people than the laboring poor. You've heard this before, but it comes again and again. Oracle, economic argument about the necessity of the slave trade. Quite extensive. This is just like the top bit. It goes way, way, way down, as it were. It's 2 full columns almost. It's also true, Oracle, 25th April, and the Star, which, by the way, is in the pay of the committee. It's all documented in the minute book. Thank you very much. The Oracle says Vasa is an imposter. He never was in Africa. This is the source of the confusion. What must that cause be, which can lean for support on falsehoods as audaciously propagated as they are easily detected? This black man is a child, is the inference in this. We see through his tissue of lies. It's an incredibly racist comment. But it starts in the Oracle. It starts in paper in the pay of the West India Planters Committee, it seems to me. And Wilberforce is supposedly attacking the trade because he's supposedly investing in alternative sugar colonies in the west of Africa. And that's what it's really all about. He's just in this to make money. Thank you very much. And so here's the speech that would have been given if Pitt had given them enough time. This is published by the committee, and Gilbert Franklin, maybe one of the 2 heads of the committee. Popular opinion doesn't want this. This is April, so the question's already been called, but it's still a little bit in process. Petitions calling for it were secured by artifice. This is extremely common. They deceived the people of Great Britain, somewhere between 390 and 400,000 signatories. They were deceived into signing this petition, and people who weren't of age signed the petition, people who had no standing signed the petition. Thank you very much. The petitions should be completely disregarded and thrown out. It's a major, major theme, and you don't need to fix the condition of the slaves because they're super well off anyway. So let's print 1,000 copies at the expense of the committee. So here we have Mr. Felix McCarthy comes to the committee, and he's willing to sell the copyright. He's written this to please the committee. Go where the money is if you're an author. And they say, yes, we'll give him £100 for the copyright. Thank you very much. And the clamor, the West Indian planters are poor victims. They're assailed by people who don't really know. So the clamor, which has been so insidiously raised against the West India merchants and planters, the unfair arts which have been employed to calumniate, la 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 la, they've been borne down a torrent of furious invective, which has been poured out against the West India traders and planters, which portends more calamitous consequences to the colonies than even their native hurricanes. Nice figure, but still not so great. And here you can see way back on page 60, this is a long pamphlet, but the slaves, they were not impatient of bondage. He had frequently witnessed them at their diversion as lively and jocund as Frenchmen. Roger, I hope you're listening. That the tenderness of the planters had been proved by thousands of instances recorded in the papers on the table, the evidence. The Negroes were much more comfortably off, and any abolition would damage the national revenue. So, and it goes on. I mean, it goes on for another 41 pages. Thank you. So there are 3 different editions of this pamphlet. None of them denominate which edition they are, and they're all different settings of type. But if you study this a little bit, as I felt compelled to do, no one is a line-by-line setting of the other. They were sent to 3 different shops. They were sent to 3 different shops for simultaneous setting, I believe, so that there would be rapidity of production, right? Because the matter is at this very time before the Commons. And so this is the last ditch effort to try to put out one more piece of print to win the public, to win the Commons. In fact, ladies and gentlemen, there is the introduction, there is a parliamentary maneuver. The planters see that they're going to lose, or it looks like they're going to lose, and they introduce the word, which wins, right before the word abolition, gradual. That motion passes, and they don't decide when the gradual abolition is going to go. They pass for the gradual abolition. Eventually, they determine that it'll be 96, but nobody ever moves the question again. So they win, the abolitionists win, but they lose. And they can't get anything through the Lords because the Lords say, well, we don't know the will of the people. And besides, we have the royal family interest. We have the Duke of Clarence and his brothers. You're SOL. Nothing's going to happen here. Thank you very much. So it's a victory, but it's not a victory because of the brilliant and pernicious last-minute introduction of a motion of a single word that forestalls Wilberforce's victory, a victory that will not be won until 1807 for the abolition of the slave trade. Remarkable, remarkable. And Wilberforce hangs on to this victory. Well, you did say you'd pass it, the gradual abolition. Tell us what the date is. And of course, the opposition refuses to say what the date is because why should they? And it goes on. So now it's June of '92, and we're going to see a very new pamphlet indeed. The bookseller's name is withheld. This is, again, a highly tendentious, deeply mendacious pamphlet. The witnesses brought forward have been committed to take their trial for perjury. Completely not true. There are radical fanatics and Jacobins set on destroying Britain. Okay, the secret society of the old Jewry, this is where they're meeting. And there's a lot of anti-Semitic invective as well against the abolitionists who are Shylockian Jews seeking to undermine the integrity of the country. It's partly hinted at here. It's overt in other ones. The people who have offered testimony, they're discarded servants, starving surgeons, sailors taken drunk from the stews, parsons convicted of adultery. And but we don't know who the bookseller is. It only runs one edition. It's so inflammatory. so they want to make the country like France. That's really what they want to do. They want blood in the streets. Thank you very much. But these self-named friends of the people, they had the clamor of petitions, untruths, misrepresented facts, and all the rest. But fortunately, the slaves are going to continue. They didn't want any change. They're going to continue to live under the blessings of our glorious Constitution. Thank you very much. It may remind you of some of the political rhetoric today, and so on. So, but we know who the publisher is, and it won't come as a surprise to you. Oh, Mirabile Dictu, it's in the Oracle, September 92. This day is published for John Bell, a very new pamphlet indeed. So we if you pay attention, if you follow the spoor, you can learn a lot. Debret submitted a bill. Let's look into it to make sure. He's one of the main publishers. This is kind of toward the end now. By the way, we need to pay off the doorkeeper of the House of Commons because he was dispensing pamphlets. Mr. Bell is going to transmit the pamphlets to the circulating libraries of all the watering places. They're arming up to fight the next battle. They know it's coming. And the abolitionists are too. Mr. Hibbert's going to give Dr. William Thompson, who we saw earlier, 50 pounds. He should keep putting things in the Whitehall Evening Post because we have to keep this going now because those pertinacious abolitionists are going to come for us again, and we need to be ready. So this, ladies and gentlemen, is a cartoon from 1828. The campaign for the abolition of slavery, the Sequent campaign, which I'm not going to go into, but the campaign for the abolition of slavery, which won't be won until the early years of the next decade, is on full bore. And here is Cruikshank. And you can see the same charges, canteen humbug, petitions being signed by children, a Quaker who sang buy only East India sugar, but it turns out he's in the pay of the East India plantations, pictures of Negro slavery. Let's put this here when they're looking through the horrified Englishmen. Let's vend some more pamphlets, but really, what are they doing in the sugar colonies? They're having a party, right? So same old, right? Which is partly why we need to study this. The same fatuous arguments are adduced. So in 2013, not so very far from here, I was giving a lecture, going to give a lecture that afternoon on the image of the slave ship Brooks in the Skillman Library of Lafayette College. And I looked out the window and I saw this remarkable piece of sculpture. And this sculpture called Transcendence honors a man who became the college's first Afro-American graduate who was born into slavery, but ended up being a physician in the greater New York area. And that made me think. It made me think about what the humanities are for and why we study what we study. I was taught many years ago, I think by the Jesuits at Xavier High School on 16th Street in New York, that studying the humanities was about studying what was true and good and beautiful so that our lives and maybe the lives of our students might become a little more true and good and beautiful. But today's lecture has very little to do with truth. It's about falsehood. It doesn't have much to do with good. It's about evil factors defending their interest. It doesn't have very much to do at all with what is beautiful In fact, we see today a kind of moral ugliness. And looking out the window that beautiful fall afternoon at Lafayette College on this work of art, I thought to myself, I am studying the image of the slave ship Brooks. But people live in slavery in my time. Between 29 and 40 million men, women, and children, depending upon which NGO you talk to, today in our world are human slaves. 70% of that, let's say 29, let's lowball, million men and women are in fact women and children. 70%. What do we study the humanities for? What is the burden of the privilege we have of being in the archive, of coming to the 6th floor of the Kislak Library, if it's not to enlarge our sensibilities, maybe not always by studying what is true or good or beautiful, but sometimes by finding the moral ugliness in our world and seeking some form of appropriate redress. The burden of these lectures, ladies and gentlemen, is partly about the possibilities of bibliography. But if it begins and ends there, then I have failed you. Because it seems to me that the burden of these 2021 A.S.W. Rosenbach lectures are in part about our seeing the powerful truths and the terrible lies that were promulgated in another time. Thinking about the choices that we must make in our own. Thank you very much.
We can take a few questions now if there are any. Take one from the room and then one from Zoom. Anything? You have one on Zoom?
Yeah, there's actually quite a few from the Zoom, which I can just read one observation first, which comes from D. Andrews. Great question about Clarkson's case. Clarkson always worked fast. Undoubtedly, he published the case in Ipswich because he lived around the corner and could deliver the manuscript personally. And then the following question is this related to what you were just saying, in fact. The suppression of abolitionists by the newspapers owned by wealthy and remote landowners reminds me very much of the situation that we are experiencing in Minneapolis right now. What other deep connections do you see in the literature of this period and our own time?
Yeah, I think in some ways I've adduced the core connection, which is it would be terrible for us to be innocent of the moral enormities of our own time if 29 to 40 million people were in slavery. And we know that most of those are women and children, and most of those are, of course, involved in sex trafficking. How can we ignore that reality in our own world? And if we call ourselves scholars, are we scholars to sequester ourselves? Or are we scholars because our pursuit of truth drives us out beyond the walls to be a force for good in the world? So what will we choose? I think that's the question is, what do you choose? You know, knowing what we know, what do you choose?
Thanks, Michael. I wanted to go back to that, what you drew attention to of that flip where the pro-slavery people say, this isn't just about our country, this is about humanity. And I think that invocation of humanity probably happens a lot on the abolitionist side too, as well as talking about the nation. And I'm just curious, in your reading of all this, the sort of the contest that's taking place in print, is there a consistent moral frame of reference? Is this about the nation? Is this about humanity? Is this about we're good Christians? Are people just grabbing whatever comes to hand and it's all over the place? I'm just curious if there's a consistent frame of reference or if it's changing with the pamphlet and if that's connected at all to print.
Thank you. There are themes that are adduced over and again. but there is a grab what you can and run with it. And there's so many pamphlets, pro and con, that there isn't, one can't say that there's a particular leitmotif that runs through them all. So for example, early in the game, the Clarkson gets a hold of the muster rolls of the ships and of the British Navy. And he proves through painstaking research, remarkable research, that far from being, quote unquote, a nursery for seamen, that is to say, training up young sailors to equip them to become sailors in the British Navy so that Britannia could rule the waves, far from being a nursery for seamen, that the death rate of common sailors on the slave ships was 4 times, if I remember correctly, greater than the death rate on British naval ships because of all the disease of keeping the slaves in such close quarters, right? So, so part of the argument adduced in the print of the slave ship Brooks, if you read the letterpress carefully, is that this notion of the nursery for seamen is nonsense, and that in fact it's the grave of these young sailors before they ever make it into the British Navy. And he bases that on a massive research project. Of course, Clarkson deserves our plaudits for all his foibles, in part because of his moral courage in going to places like Liverpool and walking into the drinking establishments and interviewing sailors and seeking people who had been to the West Indies. And at one point, he almost gets killed. And at several points, he has to hide from the crowd because they want to kill him because he's a threat to their commerce. He's a threat to their livelihood. So there's a lot of interviewing human subjects, as it were, but there's also a kind of archival work with these muster rolls that I think is really important. So of course, there's an argument about humanity. I think I would say if I had to, summarize in one sentence, I would say the contest is between British liberty and British property, the 2 cornerstones of the Constitution, right? I mean, all you have to do is read Locke, right? So if you read John Locke, there's liberty and there's property, and then maybe with Jefferson et al, there's happiness, depending on how you read that. But of course, the planters scream property. We did this under the law. We did this by ancient agreements, right? And in fact, when slavery is abolished, there's massive restitution to the planters for the value of their property. So they're saying, no, the law is the law and the law protects property and we're businessmen. And by the way, we're good for the empire. And what the abolitionists say over and again is human liberty is a sacred trust and no human being has a right to violate liberty. Remember all the way back to the second slide of the first lecture, the essay prize, is it lawful to enslave the unwilling? That's the subject. That's the subject that Clarkson writes on. And he says, if this is true, somebody's got to dedicate his life to this. Let it be me. He chooses. And when he chooses, they rally behind him. And the rest is the story that we've been unfolding. But so liberty or property, and they weren't seen as being inimical before, but in the matter of slavery, they are seen as being inimical. And this becomes a great contest, I submit, for the soul of the British nation. Yeah. But both parties will say it's actually in our true interest to keep the status quo or to change the status quo, and they'll both say it's actually more moral to keep the status quo or change the status quo, depending on what side you're on. So yeah, does that answer your question? Both. It's both. And again, there's the spectrum of argument in the pamphlets is so broad. I think I've probably read about 400 of them closely, and the spectrum is just so broad in the kinds of appeal that they make. Everything from invective against the opponent to saying, be your best self. You know, and of course, there are a lot of people who also make a case and say, we don't need to abolish the slave trade, we need to reform the conduct of slavery, right? So that's a lot of it, right? And the Dolben Act, which I passed over probably quite irresponsibly, but the Dolben Act, which changes the crowding on the slave ships when the horrors of the Middle Passage are become more widely known. The Dolben Act says, well, no, we're going to limit the number of slaves that you can carry, and you can only carry 5 slaves for every 3 tons in terms of the carrying capacity of the ship. And this is seen as this great clement gesture, this great humanitarian gesture. And there are some abolitionists who say, why are you reforming? Why are you trying to reform what's already irretrievably corrupt? And there are others who say, well, we have to take the measures we can because men and women are dying in the Middle Passage and dying in the period of seasoning when they land because of the exigencies of the Middle Passage. Yeah.
I think we'll do 2 more questions, one from Zoom and one from the room.
All right, one from Zoom. What were the major differences between abolition in England and in the US that led the Americans to prevent outlawing slavery for another 6 decades? Were Americans less literate? Was communication in the US substantially different, where written communication mattered less? Or did the financial incentives to preserve slavery override any abolitionist publications?
It's a really good question. I've asked myself that question over and again because, of course, I'm an American trained in Britain, right? So it's a troubling question, it seems to me. It's also true that the life expectancy of the slave in the South was far greater than the life expectancy of the slave in the sugar colonies. And the ability of the women slaves in the South to bear children was much greater as a result. And so part of what's happening, and it's not an adequate explanation at all, it's just one small aspect of a large and complicated picture, is that women slaves in the United States are able to have children, and those children are born into slavery. And that becomes really important for the maintenance of the system, because you want young, fertile women slaves so that you can have as many children as possible, and they'll be slaves, and they're worth a lot of money, and their labor is worth a lot of money. When you start to read the more technical literature about the sugar colonies, it's adduced over and again that almost no women slaves in the sugar colonies, because of the brutality of their treatment, because of the length of their working hours, and because of the lack of, in some cases, adequate nutrition, they lose the menarche, right? They lose the menses, they're not fertile, they're not able to bear children, which says something about the profound human physical stress that they're placed under. And so that has a significant effect on the arc of slavery and the slave trade in these 2 different locales. There's also a great deal about geographical spread. There's also a great deal about different political sensibility. There's also a great deal about the galvanizing forces and when they come to the fore. 5 weeks before Thomas Clarkson dies, he's visited by a coalition of young American abolitionists. including Frederick Douglass. And they say, you have shown the way, and we will follow your path in our native country. It's very powerful. And Clarkson dies 5 weeks later, knowing that they have come to him to ask for his blessing for the campaign that they will inaugurate, partly in New England, going down into the South. Of course, we know the story. This seems to me a beautiful and powerful moment. Not that the abolitionists are pure and inviolate people. Not that Clarkson is not a multidimensional, complicated character. But at the same time, not that there weren't huge networks of tens and hundreds of thousands of men and women who were making moral choices to effect the abolition of the slave trade and then the abolition of slavery in Great Britain. But the fact that they recognized the profound leadership and the moral courage of Clarkson and take him as a kind of beacon for their own campaign, to me, is a very moving thing.
Thank you, Michael. Another parallel to, I think, our present moment is the degree to which the movement is pitted against the white working class. And I guess I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the degree to which the white working class is the audience, and if the sort of means of communicating, newspapers as opposed to pamphlets, says something about that, and what agency would they have had in this debate beyond choosing to consume sugar?
Right. So there's, if there are 400,000 signatures on those petitions, which I think is a pretty good surmise, and I think it makes no difference whatsoever if there are 400,000 or 350,000. If the numbers are true, then there is an unprecedented response from the people of Great Britain that must include the artisanal classes, must include the artisanal classes. One remarkable thing, and this is not my scholarship, this is the scholarship of another, whose name I sadly can't recall, is that when the actually Jim Green may remember, when Equiano's interesting narrative comes to New York, and 100 copies are taken by the leading bookseller in Philadelphia, because that's really where it should have been published. But the subscription list is much more working class in New York than it is when we look at the subscription lists and trace the livelihoods. It's much more patrician when we look at the subscription list for the multiple editions over a 6-year period, at least till 94, of the interesting narrative. But when it comes to New York, it's much more working class, much more artisanal. And so I don't quite know how to interpret that, and I'm not an American historian, so I'm a bit loath to posit a theory. But it does seem to me that we have the fact of the 500 plus petitions, which is an unprecedented thing. And we know from local chronicles of what was happening that the working class very much wanted to be a part of that, right? And so that seems to me, and when we look at the numbers in the consumption of print, the British working class, all the way up into Scotland, was enlivened to the problems and pitfalls of the Middle Passage, right? And identified with the forced labor aspect. In saying over and again, you should be helping the working man, there is an attempt in the pro-planter, that is to say, pro-slavery literature, to pit the working class man in Britain against the abolitionist movement, right? Because these distant people who aren't like you, who aren't worthy of your charity, are taking away the charity that you deserve. And it seems to me that that's part of the profound invidiousness of the argument.
With that, I'd like to thank you, Michael, for 3 wonderful lectures and a wonderful week here at Penn.
Thank you so much.